and how warm-ups can be influenced through what we read within the literature. So if you do have any questions, or you've got any points to make, or anything that sort of your opinion on warm-ups and whether you would do them with your athletes, then please just post them into the comments, and I'll try to get to them once I've talked through the different elements of warm-up. So there was a paper by Van den Tillaar, okay, easy for me to say, and this is a 2019 paper, and they looked at 3 different types of warm-up on sprintability, and that was looking at it within experienced soccer players. And from that paper, there's like a really quite a nice definition. And they say that warming up is a procedure that is used in mostly all sports with the intention of gradually adapting the body to physical and mental exercise for the main activity afterwards. And it's to enhance the physical activity performance and to reduce the risk of injuries during that activity. So that was quite a nice definition if you ever wanted to use a definition, because it just gives a good overview of what is involved with a warm-up. And then within that study, they actually identified what typically gets manipulated in order to develop a good warm-up. Studies sort of manipulate the duration of the warm-up, the intensity, the amount of rest that they might provide the athletes, and then also the content of the warm-up, whether that's more of an active or passive warm-up, more of a generalized warm-up or a specific warm-up, and then whether they include stretching or not. And so you might have seen a pretty big shift in terms of, I mean, when I was going through training, it's like, okay, everything, like do a static stretch, hold it for 10 to 15 seconds. That's part of the warm up. And then probably about 3-4 years ago, maybe a little bit longer, there's a big shift towards doing dynamic stretching as part of the warm up and not to do static stretching. And it almost became fashionable, which often happens within research and then within the actual practice of implementing these things, that some things become a little bit more popular than others. So they're the things that can be manipulated: duration, intensity, rest, and then the content. I actually had some students today, we were going through how to deliver warm-ups using things like a ramp protocol. I don't know whether you've come across a ramp protocol before, but it's all about raising the body temperature. So the RAMP stands for is the ramp, okay, and the R is for raise, so raising body temperature. A is then to activate the muscles which may be involved within the movement. M to mobilize the joints which are involved, and then P to potentiate, so actually identify the movements and movement patterns which are associated with that sport and implement them. So that's a ramp protocol if you haven't come across it before. So obviously, then we look at the study, and the study had the aim to try and investigate the specificity and duration of warm-up on sprint performance across 40 meters. So it's only one parameter. Obviously, it's difficult to decide upon performance of these kind of players, because soccer players obviously don't normally just sprint for 40 meters in a game and that's it. I don't think they get very far in their career. So they obviously have different demands which are placed upon them. And so you have to consider the demands of the sport and how these tests actually apply. So this study put into place 3 different warm-ups. The first one was a long generalized warm-up. It consisted of like 10 minutes jogging at 60 to 75% of maximal heart rate. Then they did 7 dynamic exercises for the shoulders, hip, knee, and ankle joints and ran those through 10 times. They did a jog, again, at 60 to 75% of maximal heart rate. And the total duration of that warm-up intervention was 20 minutes. The second intervention was the same as that long generalized warm-up, but this was more specific because it had acceleration runs, which were at 75, 85, and 95% of their estimated sprint speed, maximal sprint speed, and they had a 60-second rest in between. And then they did some jogging, and that lasted for a total of 20 minutes. And then the final aspect of this study was a short specific warm-up that consisted of 60-meter runs, 8 of them, with a 60-second rest in between. It lasted for a total of 10 minutes. And they were going for sort of a build-up in terms of increasing intensity within that warm-up. So it was quite interesting because they found there was a significant effect for warm-up protocols on sprint performance. So the warm-up protocol did have an effect. So actually all the protocols actually decreased sprint time. but actually the 40-meter sprint times were significantly longer after the long warm-ups compared to the other warm-up. So the long warm-up actually didn't benefit the athletes in any way. So that's quite interesting, because you would have thought the longer you warm up, the more effective that would be in terms of increasing flexibility, increasing muscle power, increasing the amount of motor units which are recruited. But that wasn't the case in this paper, and actually some of the papers that we're going to look at further down that were in the journal club. So they're saying that just by doing a long general warm-up, actually we're going to promote the sympathetic nervous system. So we're going to increase heart rate, we're going to increase respiratory ratio, which we'd expect. It'd increase muscle temperature. It'll help to reduce the amount of muscle stiffness and muscle stiffness in and around joints. But then it's still not enough to increase maximal sprint performance. So the maximal sprint performance was increased when we did a shorter duration warm-up. So it would have had the same effects, apart from it may not have induced the same amount of fatigue within their muscles, and therefore they might have had a greater output in terms of their performance. So the next paper that I want to touch upon is the Yancey paper. And this looked at the physiological demands and identifying that the content, duration, and intensity of the warm-up needs to match those physical demands. There was quite an interesting point that they made within the paper, that said approximately a warm-up should be a minimum of 10 minutes to allow the greatest benefit. So the previous paper was saying around about 10-minute warm-up. This one's saying the same, both 2019 papers. So if we have a look at that, they identified that a warm-up with a duration of 25 minutes could potentially cause fatigue and therefore decrease physical performance. So when they looked at these three different warm-ups, again, 25-minute warm-up, 15-minute warm-up, and 8-minute warm-up, all with the same activities, just depended upon the duration, they reduced it down to fit the time that they were doing it for. When they did the 25-minute protocol, it showed that there's a decreased performance in the 10-meter sprint and the 20-meter sprint. When there was a 15-minute warm-up, there was no significant changes that were observed. However, when they did this 8-minute warm-up, which is just a shortened version of everything that had gone before, that significantly improved performance in the 10-meter sprint time. In the study, they also looked at the counter movement jump and vertical jump capacity, and also a modified agility test. And none of the warm-ups actually significantly affected the time that those were performed in. So it really seems to be applicable towards those sprinting measurements, whether you have to go in a straight line. I think that sometimes we overlook the psychological aspect of sport. Sometimes we're very much sort of biomedical. We like to think about all the different aspects associated with the anatomy of what's going on, but sometimes we don't consider psychology. So I always try to throw a psychology paper in there somewhere. And so when we look at the paper by Gill and Mercelino, they looked at how what the literature looks like around warm-ups and how we can assess whether a psychological aspect of warm-up is present. And so in this case, they looked at the warm-up psychological factors, and they said that actually in the literature there's no real solid evidence to identify that the warm-ups really improve those psychological factors. They did identify that most of the successful Olympic athletes had shown greater use of certain performance strategies associated with psychology. So things like self-talk, doing emotional control strategies, doing automatic imagery to imagine where they're going to be and how they're going to perform. However, again, not really built on solid evidence as to using psychology within that warm-up. They did identify that really that warm-up should last between 10 and 15 minutes. So sort of in keeping with the literature that we've seen from a physiological point of view, looking at that 8 minutes and the 10 minutes from the previous study. And then we move on to the Petrusek paper. I hope I said that right. And that was looking at neuromuscular control training. So basically doing some hop and hold type training, the things where we require balance and strength within the limb. And they identified that if we look at ACL kind of papers and the injury prevention papers there, that there's actually a reduced risk of injury around about 50% in female athletes by doing this neuromuscular training type modalities, things like strength training, plyometrics, balance exercises, and stretching in order to identify the muscles which are being used within the sport. The real things that I took from it were that we need to identify and look at landing mechanics in order to identify those who potentially might be a greater risk, looking at potential alignment in both the frontal plane and also the sagittal plane as well. And we know that the whole stability in and around the lower limb on landing can be influenced by both the hip stability and also the overall trunk stability as well. So we do need to take that into account if we are going to try and reduce risk of injury. There's obviously been some papers which have looked at reducing risk of injury, and sometimes that ties into the warm-up. So things like the FIFA 11 Plus program was a 20-minute warm-up protocol to use with amateur-based athletes, consisting of 15 different exercises which covered the strength, plyometrics, agility, and field balance type techniques. And so that's quite interesting because it ties into the paper we just spoke about, looking at neuromuscular techniques and control. And those sort of athletes who conducted a FIFA 11 Plus, and most of the time they are amateur athletes, so this doesn't really have an effect at the elite level. But in those amateur athletes, you're talking about having about a 72% reduction in injury based upon their improvements. So that's really interesting, especially if you are working with more amateur-based athletes. So definitely worth considering. And then one of the big things that is coming around at the moment is the use of Nordic hamstring exercises. You would have seen athletes going on those things called a Nord board, where they link their feet in and they can measure the amount of force output which is occurring, and the amount of pressure that the feet are putting onto those cuffs, which then equates to some of the force being produced by the hamstring. We can also take more simple measures if you haven't got anything or any great equipment. So you could actually video the athlete and you could watch them going down. So from that position where the heels are being held, and as they go forwards, and the point at which they can no longer hold that position and they fall to the floor, that's called a Nordic break angle. So we can actually measure that angle. If you record it on your phone, it's quite easy to put an angle on it. And they come forward, and then at that point where they can no longer hold it, that sort of gives us an indication about how well they can control that eccentric loading of the hamstrings. We actually had a paper out, must be last year or about 18 months ago now, and that looked at whether Nordic hamstring exercises, first of all, could be detrimental to performance. So whether sports teams, particularly soccer teams, would want to include it within their own training program. It actually showed there's no detriment to performance, and actually in some parameters it increased performance. So that's actually really, really interesting. But in terms of this injury prevention, the Van Dijk paper on the Journal Club looked at Nordic hamstring exercises, and it identified that it reduced hamstring injury rates by around about 51%.